Dust rolled across the main street of Dry Creek, clinging to boots, wagon wheels, and every whispered word that rode the hot wind. In a place where every man's business was shouted over whiskey and every woman's reputation judged at the Sunday service, Eleanor Hayes lived like a shadow among them. They called her the Obese Widow when they thought she wasn't listening, though the cruel nickname traveled quicker than a bullet. She walked with her head lowered, skirts brushing the dirt, as if hoping the earth might swallow her before the townsfolk's eyes cut her apart again. Loneliness was her companion. Her husband, Thomas Hayes, had been a kind man with a broad laugh, but fever had stolen him a year back, leaving Eleanor with little more than a worn boarding house, overdue taxes, and memories that clung like stubborn dust to the walls. Without children, without kin nearby, she bore the silence of her home as bravely as she could. But courage in Dry Creek never lasted long. The town had a way of breaking spirits, especially spirits it had already judged unworthy. Before we step further into Eleanor's story, let me pause for a moment. If you find yourself drawn into this tale of grit, sorrow, and unexpected redemption, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss a single chapter of this journey through the Old West, where every soul fights to be seen and every heart searches for a place to belong. The sun burned high that day, its light unkind, showing every wrinkle of the wooden buildings and every cruel smirk on the faces gathered by the saloon. Eleanor walked past them carrying a basket of bread she had baked herself, the loaves meant for trade at the general store. She had risen before dawn to knead that dough, her arms aching, her back stiff, yet she walked with determination. Still, determination didn't shield her from words meant to sting. "Best stay clear, boys," one man muttered with a chuckle, loud enough for her to hear. "She might eat the bread before she sells it." Another voice, rough from tobacco, answered, "Ain't no man desperate enough for that one. Even coyotes would turn away." Their laughter followed her steps. Eleanor's cheeks burned, though she kept her eyes fixed on the path ahead. Pride was her only weapon. If she looked back, if she showed one crack in her armor, the gossip would spread like fire through prairie grass. She had learned long ago that silence was sometimes stronger than reply. Inside, however, her heart pulsed heavy. The words struck deep, tearing through the small threads of self-worth she had managed to sew together since Thomas's death. She missed his voice, how he used to call her Darling Nell, how he never cared that she was rounder than other women. He had loved the way she filled a room with laughter, not with ridicule. Without him, laughter had become rare, and ridicule constant. At the general store, Mrs. Wilkins, sharp-nosed and sharper-tongued, weighed Eleanor's bread with the air of someone doing charity. "Bread's a bit heavy, don't you think?" she said, lips twisting. "Guess that's no surprise." Eleanor swallowed hard, forcing her voice steady. "It will keep your family full, Mrs. Wilkins. That's what matters." The storekeeper's wife sniffed and turned away, coins clinking on the counter, as if each one carried judgment. Eleanor gathered them quickly, tucking them into her worn purse. Every cent mattered, for the taxman would come soon, and if she failed him, the boarding house would no longer be hers. Stepping outside again, she paused, closing her eyes against the blaze of the sun. The world pressed down on her shoulders, but she would not bow. Somewhere within her a quiet fire smoldered, waiting for the right spark. She did not yet know that spark would come from a child's hand, small and innocent, reaching for her with the word she had longed to hear, but never thought she would again. For now, though, Eleanor walked back toward her empty house, basket lighter, heart heavier, unaware that her story had only just begun. Morning in Dry Creek was a mix of clattering hooves, the squeak of wagon wheels, and the smell of dust that never seemed to settle. Eleanor Hayes stepped out of her boarding house with a broom in hand, sweeping the front steps, though she knew the wind would undo her work within the hour. It wasn't about keeping the steps clean, it was about keeping her dignity intact. A tidy porch made her feel she still belonged, even when the town whispered otherwise. The boarding house was nearly empty now. Travelers avoided it, preferring the newer place near the saloon. Word had spread that Eleanor's cooking was too heavy, like the widow herself, a cruel joke that had chased away business. The truth was that her meals were hearty and filling, just as they had been when Thomas was alive. Together they had welcomed cowhands, peddlers, and weary families passing through. But without him, people saw only her, and their judgment clouded everything. Inside, the air was stale. 2 empty chairs flanked the long dining table, once filled with the noise of travelers sharing stories of trail and trade. Now, silence filled the room. Eleanor pressed her palm to the worn wood, remembering how her husband's laughter used to roll through the house. The memory gave her a brief spark of warmth before fading under the weight of reality. She gathered her courage and headed into town, coins hidden deep in her purse. At the general store, conversations hushed when she entered. Men leaning against the counter smirked, one nudging the other, as if Eleanor were a joke come to life. She kept her back straight, focusing on the shelves. Flour, coffee, beans, the bare essentials. "Morning, Mrs. Hayes," said Mr. Wilkins, the storekeeper, his tone polite but flat. "Good morning," Eleanor replied, forcing a smile. "I'll need 5 pounds of flour and a tin of coffee, if you please." He measured the flour with exaggerated care, his eyes sliding toward the men behind her who snickered under their breath. One muttered, "Might want to weigh her next." Laughter broke out again, sharp as a slap. Eleanor's throat tightened, but she refused to flinch. "Coffee as well, Mr. Wilkins," she reminded him gently. Coins clinked onto the counter, more than she could afford, but pride kept her from asking for less. Every purchase cut deeper into the little she had left, and the looming tax collector haunted her thoughts like a shadow that grew darker with each passing day. On her way out, she passed the church. Women clustered by the steps, bonnets tilted low as they whispered. One voice carried, Margaret, a widow like herself, but thinner, younger, and eager to climb higher in town society. "It's a shame," Margaret said loudly enough for Eleanor to hear. "A woman ought to carry herself with discipline, especially without a husband. Some folks just don't know their place." Eleanor walked past without reply, her face calm though her heart hammered. She had learned that if she gave them nothing, their words lost some of their sting. Yet inside, a question gnawed at her. How much longer can I endure this? Back at the boarding house, she set down her parcels and stood at the window. Across the street, children played, their laughter rising like a melody she could never touch. She wondered what it might have been like to have a child of her own, someone who would not see her as a burden, but as Mama. The thought ached like an old wound. She sighed, pulling the curtains shut. The day had only begun, yet it already weighed on her like a stone she could not set down. Still, she swept the floors, stoked the stove, and prepared bread for no one in particular, because giving up, she told herself, would mean letting the town win. And though her spirit was battered, it had not yet broken. Dry Creek stirred with more noise than usual that afternoon. The sound of heavy hooves echoed down the main street, drawing curious eyes from porches and storefronts. A stranger, no, not a stranger, though seldom seen, rode in slowly, his mule train trailing behind like shadows pulled from the hills. Caleb Thornton had come down from the mountains. The man was as rugged as the land he called home. His shoulders were broad, his beard thick and streaked with grey, and his eyes carried the sharpness of one who had measured his life against wilderness and survived. Few men spoke to him when he came to town. Fewer still dared to jest in his presence. He was a figure of both mystery and intimidation, a reminder that beyond the dusty streets stretched a world that did not bow to rules of gossip and pride. Walking beside his mule was a girl of about 8 years, her bonnet crooked, her cheeks flushed with the effort of keeping pace. Anna Thornton's laughter rang out, a bright contrast to the silence that usually followed her father. She skipped now and then, holding a rag doll tucked under her arm, her small boots stirring dust. Eleanor noticed them from the doorway of her boarding house as she set out another loaf of bread to cool. The sight stirred a strange ache in her chest. Caleb seldom came to town, perhaps twice a year, to trade pelts, stock supplies, and disappear again into the mountains. She had seen him from afar, but never close enough to study the lines on his face. There was something about the way he moved, unhurried yet steady, that made the noise of the street seem small. Whispers rippled through Dry Creek. "The mountain man's back," one man muttered near the saloon. Reckon he'll keep to himself like always. Another spat tobacco into the dirt. Don't trust him. A man who chooses trees over folks ain't right in the head. But it was Anna who drew more attention than her father. Children stared curiously, yet she smiled at everyone without fear. She tugged at Caleb's sleeve and pointed at Eleanor's loaves cooling in the window. "Papa," she said in a voice loud enough for Eleanor to hear, "that lady bakes bread. Can we get some?" Caleb paused, his gaze shifting toward Eleanor. For a moment, she thought he might ignore the request and move on, but he inclined his head in a polite gesture. His voice, when he spoke, was low and even. "Afternoon, ma'am." Eleanor managed a nod, though her throat tightened. "Afternoon, Mr. Thornton." Her words came softer than she intended. Few men in Dry Creek addressed her with courtesy, and his simple greeting unsettled her in a way the insults never had. Anna stepped closer, her wide eyes fixed on Eleanor. "Your bread smells good," she said cheerfully. "Did you make it?" Eleanor blinked, surprised by the child's openness. "Yes, I did," she answered gently. "Would you like a piece?" Caleb shifted, as though ready to decline, but Anna beamed. "Yes, please." Eleanor broke off a slice, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped it in a cloth. She offered it to Anna, who took it with delight. The girl's small fingers brushed Eleanor's hand, leaving behind an unexpected warmth. "Thank you, Mom," Anna said between bites. "It's better than the bread Papa makes." Caleb's lips curved, almost into a smile. "That wouldn't take much," he admitted quietly, his voice carrying no shame, only truth. The exchange was brief, but it lingered in Eleanor's heart long after they walked on. She returned to her kitchen, staring at the empty spot where the loaf had been, feeling something stir within her. For the first time in a long while, someone had looked at her without ridicule. A child's innocent words had pierced through the walls she carried, leaving her both unsettled and strangely hopeful. The following morning, Eleanor stepped onto her porch with her basket of bread, hoping to trade at the store before the heat became unbearable. The streets were already alive with clatter, wagon wheels rattling, spurs striking wood, the metallic ring of a blacksmith hammering in the distance. Yet amid the usual stir of town life, her eyes caught sight of a small figure darting ahead of her father's stride. Anna Thornton skipped along with the careless joy of a child, untouched by the weight of gossip. Caleb walked behind her, steady as always, his presence commanding without effort. Eleanor froze for a moment, debating whether to retreat inside and spare herself the stares that always followed when she crossed paths with townsfolk. But it was too late. Anna spotted her instantly. The little girl's face lit up like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "It's the bread lady," she exclaimed, tugging her father's arm and rushing toward Eleanor. Eleanor's breath caught. No one had ever called her that before. She had been called worse names than she could count, yet never something so simple, so sweet. The girl stopped in front of her, wide-eyed and smiling. Without hesitation, she reached for Eleanor's hand, her small fingers curling around it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Your bread was the best I ever tasted," Anna declared. "Will you make more?" Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion she struggled to hide. She glanced at Caleb, who stood a few paces back, his arms crossed, watching with an expression unreadable. His eyes held no mockery, no judgment, only quiet observation. I will," Eleanor replied softly, squeezing the girl's hand gently. "Bread is something I can always make." The exchange lasted only seconds, but the effect rippled through the street. Two women standing outside the mercantile exchanged pointed looks, their whispers sharp as needles. A man leaning against the saloon wall chuckled under his breath. "Would you look at that? Widow Hayes trying her luck with the mountain man." Eleanor heard it, of course she did, but Anna's grip steadied her. For once she did not lower her eyes or retreat. She let the warmth of that small hand keep her upright. Caleb stepped closer, his voice low but clear. "Thank you, Ma'am, for your kindness yesterday." Eleanor met his gaze briefly, startled by the sincerity in his tone. "It was nothing," she said, though her voice trembled. "A child should never go hungry." Anna beamed up at her father. "Papa, can we buy bread from her again? Please?" Caleb's brows furrowed slightly, as if he weighed more than bread in that request. After a long pause, he gave a single nod. "We'll see," he said simply, his words final, yet not unkind. He touched his daughter's shoulder, guiding her gently away. As they walked on, Anna twisted back, still holding Eleanor's gaze, her little hand lifting in a wave. Eleanor raised her own, heart thudding, until the girl disappeared into the crowd. The whispers returned as soon as they were gone, swelling around her like a rising tide. "Desperate," someone muttered. "She'll latch onto anyone who'll look her way." Another voice, sharp with scorn, added, "Mark my words, the mountain man won't have it. He's too smart for that." Eleanor clenched her basket tighter, her knuckles pale. She forced herself to keep walking, her chin lifted just enough to feign strength. Inside, though, her heart wavered between shame and a fragile, blooming hope she dared not name. When she reached her boarding house again, the silence greeted her as always. Yet it no longer felt quite the same. Against all odds, a child's touch had lit a spark in her chest, one she could not smother even with fear. Dry Creek's air always carried the weight of judgment, but after Anna Thornton's innocent display of affection, the whispers around town grew sharper. Eleanor Hayes felt it in every corner, the mercantile, the church steps, even outside the post office where men gathered to share news. Her name was no longer spoken plainly. It came wrapped in laughter or pity, each word cutting deeper than the last. At the boarding house, she tried to lose herself in chores. She scrubbed floors until her hands were raw, kneaded dough until her arms ached, yet nothing drowned out the voices echoing in her mind. Desperate. Pitiful. Widow Hayes, chasing after a man who won't look twice at her. Each word stung because she feared they were right. One late afternoon, Eleanor ventured into the general store again, clutching her shopping list. The moment she stepped inside, she felt eyes on her. Mrs. Wilkins stood at the counter, gossiping with another woman, her voice pitched deliberately loud. "She ought to know better," Mrs. Wilkins said, tapping her chin with mock thought. Trying to trap a man with her bread? Shameful. And a mountain man at that. He belongs in the hills, not shackled to someone like her. The other woman snorted. "Can you imagine, poor fellow? She'd crush the life out of him." Their laughter rolled across the store. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached for a sack of beans, her knuckles brushing the shelf. She swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself not to react. Silence was her shield, though it felt paper-thin. Behind her, a man chuckled. "If Thornton takes her in, it'll be out of pity." "And pity ain't love." Eleanor turned slowly, her face calm though her heart thundered. "I came for beans, not for your opinions," she said quietly. The man blinked, surprised at her composure, but smirked anyway. "Easy now, widow. Don't get riled. Just a bit of talk." She paid for her goods and left, her back straight, her dignity intact on the outside. But once she reached the dusty road, her vision blurred. She pressed her hand against her chest, willing herself not to cry where anyone could see. That evening at church, things grew worse. Eleanor slipped into a back pew, hoping to go unnoticed. But Margaret, the rival widow with her sharp tongue and carefully pressed dress, turned in her seat to face her. Margaret's smile was sweet as poison. "Eleanor," she said, loud enough for nearby parishioners to hear. "It must be exhausting chasing after a man who doesn't want to be caught. Some women simply don't understand their place." A ripple of laughter followed. Eleanor kept her gaze on the hymnal in her lap, though her hands shook against the pages. She wanted to defend herself, to shout that she wasn't chasing anyone, that she had done nothing but offer kindness to a child, but the words stuck, trapped behind pride and pain. After service ended, Margaret approached again, her voice lowered but sharp. "You'll only humiliate yourself further if you keep on. Caleb Thornton isn't for you. Best save what dignity you have left." Eleanor looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the hunger in Margaret's eyes, the hunger for position, for being the woman admired rather than scorned. That realization steadied her. She drew a breath, replying softly, "My dignity isn't yours to measure." She walked away before Margaret could answer. Still back in her empty house, Eleanor sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. Every word of gossip, every cruel remark pressed on her chest like a weight she could no longer carry. Yet somewhere beneath the shame, a quiet ember of defiance glowed. Perhaps she thought there was strength in enduring, perhaps even more in standing tall. The road out of Dry Creek stretched long and crooked, lined with scrub brush and parched earth that cracked under the relentless sun. Eleanor guided her wagon slowly along the path, the reins rough in her hands. She had gone to gather flour from a nearby mill, choosing the quieter road instead of facing more whispers in town. The steady creak of the wagon wheels was almost soothing, until one gave a sharp crack. The wagon lurched, jolting her forward. Eleanor clutched the seat, heart racing as the wheels splintered against a rut in the ground. Dust rose around her in a choking cloud, and the horse stomped nervously. She climbed down, skirts heavy, and crouched beside the broken wheel. One glance told her what she already feared. It was too damaged for her to fix alone. She pressed her hand to her brow, sweat dripping down her temples. Alone on the open road, she felt small, vulnerable. The sun beat mercilessly on her shoulders, and for a moment despair pressed down heavier than the heat. Then, faint at first but growing louder, came the sound of hooves. Eleanor straightened, shielding her eyes. A line of mules appeared over the rise, led by a tall figure she recognized at once. Caleb Thornton, steady as stone, approached with his pack animals trailing behind. Beside him, Anna trotted along, her bonnet askew, her face bright with curiosity. Eleanor's stomach tightened. She almost wished it had been anyone else. The town could say what it liked, but facing Caleb directly stirred a different kind of fear, one that made her pulse quicken for reasons she could not name. Caleb drew the mules to a halt, his eyes scanning the broken wheel. Trouble. His voice was low, even, carrying more certainty than question. Eleanor nodded, brushing dust from her skirts. Wheel gave out on me. I was hoping it would hold a little longer. Caleb stepped closer, crouching beside the wheel. His large hands examined the splintered wood with practiced ease. Won't carry you far like this, he said. Lucky it broke here, and not deeper in the flats. Anna bounded forward before Eleanor could answer. Miss Eleanor, she exclaimed, tugging at her hand. Papa can fix anything. He fixes my doll when she breaks. A soft laugh escaped Eleanor, surprising even herself. Well, I hope your papa finds wagons no harder than dolls. Caleb gave a brief glance at the exchange, something flickering in his eyes. Without another word, he retrieved tools from one of his packs. He worked with quiet focus, his strength evident in every motion. Eleanor watched, torn between gratitude and unease. You didn't have to stop, she murmured after a time. Couldn't leave you stranded, Caleb replied, not looking up. His tone was matter-of-fact, as though the choice had never been in question. Anna leaned against Eleanor's side, holding her hand as if it belonged there. When Papa fixes it, can I ride with you back to town, please? I like your bread, and I like you too. Eleanor froze, emotion rising in her chest like a tide. She glanced at Caleb, half expecting him to scold the child, but he said nothing. His silence felt like permission. When the wheel was secure again, Caleb rose to his full height, wiping dust from his hands. It'll hold, he said simply. Eleanor met his eyes. Thank you, Mr. Thornton. I don't know what I would have done otherwise. He adjusted the strap of his pack, nodding once. You'll manage, you're stronger than you think. Anna clambered onto the wagon seat beside Eleanor, grinning from ear to ear. Caleb allowed it, walking beside the wagon as they continued toward Dry Creek. For Eleanor, the road no longer felt quite so lonely. Night fell heavy over Dry Creek, the moon rising pale against a sky thick with stars. In her boarding house, Eleanor sat at the dining table, her ledger open before her. She dipped her quill into ink, scribbling numbers with slow precision. The sums never balanced in her favor. No matter how carefully she counted, the truth stayed the same. She was weeks, perhaps days, away from losing everything. The boarding house had once kept her and Thomas comfortable. Now travelers passed her by, lured by newer lodgings or poisoned by whispers that her meals were too rich, too heavy, just like the widow herself. Eleanor traced the edge of the paper, her heart heavy. The boarding house wasn't just shelter, it was memory. Every board, every nail reminded her of the life she and Thomas had built together. Selling it would be like burying him all over again. The knock at the door startled her. She rose quickly, smoothing her apron. When she opened it, Caleb Thornton stood outside, Anna at his side, clutching her doll. Caleb removed his hat politely, his presence filling the doorway. "Evening," he said. "Forgive me for coming so late. We're needing a meal before heading home tomorrow." Eleanor blinked, surprised. "You'd like supper here?" "If you're willing," Caleb replied. "I'll pay fare." Before Eleanor could answer, Anna tugged on her hand. "Please, Miss Eleanor, your bread is the best." "Papa's cooking is not so good." Caleb's brow lifted, but there was no true reproach in his gaze, only resignation. Eleanor felt warmth creep into her chest at the child's candor. She stepped aside. "Come in then. I'll see what I can prepare." She busied herself in the kitchen, her hands steadier than they had been all day. She roasted chicken, stewed beans with herbs, and baked fresh biscuits. The aromas filled the room, rich and comforting, and for a moment the house seemed alive again. At the table, Anna chattered happily, while Caleb listened in silence, nodding now and then. When Eleanor finally joined them, Anna's eyes widened at the spread. "It looks like a feast," Eleanor smiled softly. "It's nothing fancy, just food to fill the belly." Anna bit into a biscuit, sighing in delight. "It's better than fancy." Caleb took his share quietly, but when his eyes met Eleanor's across the table, there was a flicker of something she hadn't seen before. Not pity, but respect. He spoke after a long silence. "You've a gift, Ma'am. Folks ought to pay well for meals like this." Eleanor lowered her gaze. "They don't come anymore. The boarding house is near empty. I may lose it." Anna frowned. "But then where would you live?" Caleb set down his fork, his voice steady. "I've men who come down from the hills with me. They're hungry and don't much care for my cooking either. If you'd take coin, I could bring them here when I pass through. It might help." The offer caught Eleanor off guard. It was practical, spoken without sentiment, but she sensed kindness in it too. "That would make a difference," she admitted, her voice hushed. Anna reached across the table, her small hand covering Eleanor's. "Then you can stay here, and we can come see you more. I wish you were my mama." The words pierced straight through Eleanor, stealing her breath. She blinked hard, her chest tightening with emotions she dared not show. She gave Anna's hand a gentle squeeze, whispering, "You are kind, Anna. Kinder than most." When the meal ended and father and daughter left into the cool night, Eleanor stood in the doorway long after they had gone. The house was quiet again, but not quite as empty. For the first time in many months, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. The days after Caleb and Anna's visit brought new life to Eleanor's boarding house. She scrubbed the tables with renewed purpose, baked extra loaves, and even polished the lanterns until they shone. The thought that men from the mountains might come for meals gave her hope she hadn't felt in months. But hope in Dry Creek was dangerous. It carried a price. The town wasted no time twisting what had happened. By the next church service, whispers snaked through the pews like rattlesnakes in tall grass. Eleanor felt their eyes prickling her back as she settled into her seat. She heard her name hissed from lips that pretended to pray. "Did you hear? She fed him at her house," one woman whispered. "Of course she did." "That one's desperate enough to feed the whole mountain if it meant catching him," another replied. Eleanor clenched her hymnal tighter, her knuckles pale. The words cut deeper than the heat that pressed through the church windows. Later, at the Mercantile, Margaret made sure the gossip spread even further. Standing near the flour barrels, she announced loudly, "It's plain to see what Widow Hayes is after. Imagine chasing a man with nothing but bread and biscuits, pitiful." Laughter rippled around her. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, but she refused to turn away. She lifted her chin and said quietly, "There's no shame in feeding a hungry man and his child." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps not. But there's shame in pretending kindness. When your real aim is catching yourself a husband, everyone can see it." The room grew uncomfortably still. Eleanor placed her money on the counter, gathered her flour, and walked out with as much dignity as she could muster. But each step back to her house felt heavy, as if the dust clung tighter to her skirts than ever before. That evening she sat by the window watching the street. A group of boys passed, laughing as they mimicked her gait, puffing out their chests and dragging their feet in cruel mockery. Eleanor pressed her lips together, refusing to let tears fall where anyone might see. Inside, though, the shame pressed hard against her ribs, threatening to break her. The only light in those days came from Anna. The little girl tugged at Eleanor's hand each time she saw her in town, talking as though they were old friends. One morning at the well, Anna ran up with a bright smile. "Papa says we might come back soon. Will you make pie next time?" Eleanor's heart lifted despite the stares from women nearby. "If your papa brings you, I'll make pie," she promised, brushing a curl from Anna's cheek. One of the women behind them scoffed, her voice cutting. "Shameless, using food to win a man." Anna spun around, her small face fierce. "She's not shameless. She's kind, kinder than all of you." The women fell silent, startled by the child's boldness. Caleb appeared a moment later, his tall figure casting a shadow across the well. He rested a hand gently on Anna's shoulder, his eyes sweeping over the gossips. He said nothing, but the weight of his gaze made them look away. Then he nodded once at Eleanor, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement, before guiding his daughter off. Eleanor watched them leave, her heart torn between fear of the town's cruelty and the fragile warmth Anna's words had planted in her. She knew the whispers would not stop. They would only grow. But for the first time she wondered if maybe the voices didn't matter as much as she had believed. Sunday came hot and merciless, the sun pouring through the windows of the small clapboard church. The congregation fanned themselves with hymnals, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of horse sweat drifting in from the hitching posts outside. Eleanor sat alone near the back, her head bowed, hands clasped tightly. She had chosen her best dress, though it was worn at the cuffs, and pinned her hair with care. Still, she felt the weight of every eye upon her, some curious, others openly hostile. The sermon ended, and as the pastor closed his Bible, a murmur swept through the pews. Margaret stood, her voice sharp and cold, carrying easily across the hushed room. "Pastor," she began, though her gaze fixed directly on Eleanor, "I wonder if this church has room for those who make a mockery of virtue. Some widows, it seems, cannot carry themselves with grace, but instead lower themselves to desperate schemes." Gasps rippled through the room. Eleanor's stomach twisted. She kept her eyes down, willing herself not to shake. Margaret's words were no surprise, but hearing them spoken aloud in God's house was a cruelty she had not expected. "She serves meals to men at her house alone," Margaret continued. "Is that the behavior of a respectable woman, or of one seeking to trap a man who does not want her?" Laughter and whispers swirled, the sound like nettles against Eleanor's skin. Her face burned hot, her hands trembling in her lap. For a moment she considered fleeing, rushing out into the sun and leaving them to their scorn. But something within her stilled her steps. Pride, dignity, call it what it was, the last scrap of herself she would not surrender. Slowly Eleanor rose. Her voice, when it came, was low but steady. "I have fed the hungry because they were hungry. Nothing more. If kindness has become a sin, then I will bear it. But I will not hang my head in shame for offering bread to a child and her father." Her words hung in the air, fragile yet firm. The room quieted, though whispers still lurked like shadows. Margaret smirked, about to speak again, when another voice cut through the silence. "That's enough." Caleb Thornton stood near the door, tall and unyielding, his presence commanding attention. He had come quietly, unnoticed until now, but his voice carried with the force of a hammer striking iron. Margaret faltered. "Mr. Thornton, surely you see—" "I see a woman who showed kindness to my daughter," Caleb interrupted, his tone even, leaving no room for argument. His eyes swept the room, steady and piercing. "There's no shame in that. Only honor." The congregation shifted uneasily. No one dared laugh now. The weight of Caleb's words pressed heavy, silencing even the boldest tongues. Anna, standing at his side, tugged on his hand and whispered, "Papa, can we sit with her?" Her voice carried just enough for those nearest to hear. Eleanor's heart clenched. She lowered her gaze, afraid of what her expression might betray. Caleb gave his daughter a nod and led her down the aisle, taking the empty space beside Eleanor, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The service closed in uneasy silence. The gossip drowned under Caleb's quiet authority. When the final hymn ended, Eleanor stepped outside into the heat, her breath shaky but her back straight. For once the town had seen her not bowed beneath ridicule, but standing tall with someone at her side. She knew the whispers would return, cruel as ever. But a shift had begun. Respect, faint but real, had been planted like seed in dry soil. And seeds, however small, had a way of growing. The days after the church service felt different. Though the whispers had not vanished, they carried less bite when Caleb's name lingered nearby. People respected him, even feared him a little, and his defense of Eleanor had carved a quiet space for her to breathe. It was fragile, like thin ice over a stream, but it was enough. One evening, Eleanor lit her stove early, preparing stew with beans, onions, and venison she had managed to trade. The smell drifted warmly through the boarding house when another knock sounded at the door. She opened it to find Caleb and Anna once more. Anna's face lit up as she clutched her doll. "Miss Eleanor, Papa says we can eat with you again." Caleb gave a small nod. "If you've a meal to spare, I'll pay fare." Eleanor stepped aside. "You're welcome here." "No payment necessary." Caleb paused, his gaze steady. "I won't take charity." "Then call it trade," Eleanor replied gently. "You bring me venison, and I'll turn it into supper. Seems fair enough." For the first time, Caleb's mouth curved into something close to a smile. "Fair enough." At the table, Anna chattered while Eleanor served stew and fresh cornbread. "Papa told me Mama used to make cornbread too," the child said suddenly. "But I don't really remember, I was little." Eleanor's spoon hesitated mid-air. She glanced at Caleb, unsure if the subject was welcome. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Her mother died of fever. Been just the two of us since." Anna looked up at Eleanor, her eyes bright and earnest. "Sometimes I wish I had a mama again. Maybe God will send me one." Eleanor's throat tightened, the weight of the child's words pressing deep. She forced a small smile. "God often surprises us in ways we don't expect." Caleb cleared his throat, redirecting gently. "Eat your stew, Anna." His tone was firm but not unkind. The rest of the meal passed in comfortable silence, broken by Anna's occasional giggles and the crackle of the stove. When the bowls were empty, Eleanor brought out a small pie she had baked earlier. Anna's delight was instant. "Pie!" she exclaimed, clapping her hands. "Papa, I told you she'd make pie one day." Eleanor laughed softly, setting a slice before her. "For you keep promises well, Anna." As the girl ate, Caleb leaned back slightly, his gaze resting on Eleanor. "You've been alone since your husband passed." "Yes," Eleanor answered quietly. "He's been gone over a year now. The house feels empty without him." Caleb's eyes softened, though his voice remained calm. "It takes strength to carry on." "Not everyone can." Eleanor lowered her gaze, warmth stirring in her chest. Few people had ever spoken of her strength. They spoke of her weight, her widowhood, her supposed desperation, but never her endurance. To hear it from him meant more than she dared admit. When the evening drew late, Caleb rose, placing coins on the table. Eleanor shook her head. "I told you trade is enough." He met her eyes, steady as the mountains. "And I told you I won't take for nothing. Let the ledger balance." Reluctantly, she accepted. Anna hugged her tightly before leaving, whispering, "I wish you were my mama." Eleanor stood in the doorway long after they vanished into the night, her heart caught between sorrow and hope. Trust was building, slow as a river carving stone, but it was there, and for the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of belonging. The wind began with a whisper, tugging at the shutters of the boarding house. By dusk, it roared like a freight train barreling across the plains. Eleanor secured what she could, latching windows and pushing cloth into the cracks to keep out the dust. The sky turned a sickly green, clouds rolling low and angry. Dry Creek was no stranger to storms, but this one promised to test more than fences and roofs. Outside, thunder cracked, rattling the very bones of the house. Rain came hard after, pelting the earth until the street turned to mud. The lanterns in town flickered dimly against the darkness, their glow swallowed by the storm's fury. Eleanor moved quickly, lighting candles, setting blankets near the stove. She had lived through storms before, but tonight felt different, more dangerous, more demanding. The first knock came just as the wind howled loudest. Eleanor opened the door to find a young couple drenched to the skin, their wagon stranded in the mire. "Please, ma'am," the man said, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "We'll pay what you ask, just shelter for the night." "Come in," Eleanor urged, ushering them inside. "No payment needed. Dry yourselves by the fire." One by one, more knocks followed. A cowhand with his injured brother, shivering from cold. A peddler with goods soaked through. By nightfall, the boarding house was full, every chair and bench occupied, the air heavy with wet clothes and nervous chatter. Eleanor moved among them, steady as a ship's captain in storm, serving hot coffee, passing out bread, wrapping blankets around weary shoulders. She stoked the fire high, her face flushed with heat, her hands never still. For the first time in a long while, her house was alive again, not with mockery but with gratitude. Then came another knock, firm and certain. Eleanor opened the door to find Caleb and Anna, both soaked from the rain. Caleb's hair clung dark to his forehead, his beard dripping water. Anna shivered in his arms, eyes wide. "We were caught on the road," Caleb explained simply. "The girl needed shelter." Eleanor stepped back without hesitation. "You're both welcome here." Anna rushed to her, wrapping small arms around her waist. "I knew you'd let us in," she whispered, her voice trembling with cold. Eleanor's heart squeezed as she guided them inside. She set Anna by the fire, drying her hair with a cloth, while Caleb helped stack logs beside the stove. Their presence felt like an anchor amid the storm's chaos. Hours passed, the storm beating relentlessly against the walls. Eleanor kept the fire alive, moving with quiet strength. When the injured cowhand groaned in pain, she knelt to check his fever, preparing cool cloths. When the young wife began to cry softly, Eleanor sat beside her, murmuring words of comfort until the woman calmed. Caleb watched her, silent but attentive, his dark eyes following her every move. Finally, when she set another pot of beans to simmer, he spoke low. "You've a way of holding people steady. This house feels different with you at its heart." Eleanor looked at him, startled, but found no jest in his face, only truth. She swallowed hard, unsure how to answer, so she turned back to the pot, her cheeks warming. By dawn, the storm broke. The streets lay in ruin, fences down, wagons half buried in mud. But inside Eleanor's boarding house, weary travelers rose with gratitude. They pressed coins into her hands despite her protests, thanking her for saving them from the night's fury. When the last guest departed, Eleanor leaned against the doorway, exhausted but filled with quiet pride. For once her house had stood strong against both storm and scorn. And in the shadows near the hearth, Caleb's steady gaze told her that he had seen her not as the widow mocked by town, but as a woman of true strength. The storm had left Dry Creek battered. Fences lay twisted, roofs leaked, and wagons sank into deep ruts carved by the rain. Yet for Eleanor Hayes, the greater storm still loomed unseen. The taxman arrived 2 days later, his boots muddy, his voice clipped as he delivered the notice. "You've a fortnight to pay what's owed," he said, handing her the folded paper. "If you cannot, the property reverts to county." Eleanor's hands shook as she unfolded the page, her eyes tracing the figures she already knew too well. The storm's shelterers had paid her generously, but not enough. She was still short, and no amount of bread or beans would fill the gap in so little time. When the man left, Eleanor sank into a chair, the weight of despair pressing hard. Losing the boarding house meant losing her last tie to Thomas, the walls that held his laughter, the floors they had walked together. She pressed her hands against the wood, whispering, "I can't let you go." That evening, Caleb returned with Anna. The girl skipped ahead, smiling, as though storms and taxmen had never existed. Caleb entered more slowly, his eyes steady on Eleanor. "You've had visitors," he said, nodding toward the papers stacked on her table. "Not the kind I welcome," Eleanor replied, her voice low. The county means to take this house from me." Anna froze mid-step, turning wide eyes to Eleanor. "But you can't leave. Where will you go?" Eleanor forced a smile, though her heart cracked. "I don't know yet, little one." Caleb studied her, then spoke with quiet certainty. "There's a way to keep it. If you'll have me." Eleanor blinked, startled. "What do you mean?" "Marry me," he said simply. "What's mine will be yours. The tax won't touch you then. My furs, my land, my trade, they'll cover the debt." The words struck her like a blow. Marriage. She had dreamed once of such a bond, of love that might heal the wounds the town left open. But fear rushed in, quick and merciless. "People will say you pity me," she whispered. "They'll laugh at you, at us both." Caleb's eyes did not waver. "Let them. They've laughed before. I don't live for their words." Anna tugged on Eleanor's hand, her voice trembling. "Please, Miss Eleanor. I want you to be my mama. I prayed for one and God sent you." The child's plea tore through Eleanor's defenses. She knelt, pulling Anna close, pressing her cheek against the girl's damp hair. Tears burned her eyes, spilling freely at last. "Sweet girl," she whispered, her voice breaking, "you deserve more than I can give." Anna shook her head fiercely. "You give love." "That's all I want." Caleb stepped nearer, his shadow falling over them. "This isn't pity," he said firmly. "It's choice. You've shown strength where others only mock. You've cared for Anna like she was your own. I've watched, and I know. I don't ask out of need. I ask because I want a life with you." Eleanor looked up, her vision blurred with tears. His face was steady, his voice unshaken. For the first time, she believed the possibility that someone might see her not as the widow mocked by Dry Creek, but as a woman worthy of respect, of partnership, of love. Her breath trembled. "I'll need time to think," she whispered. Caleb nodded once. "Then take it." "I'll wait." As he left with Anna, Eleanor stood in the doorway, her heart torn between fear of ridicule and the aching hope that had begun to bloom. The decision weighed heavy, but Anna's words lingered in her ears like a song. "Mama, don't leave us." The morning sun spilled across Dry Creek, but its warmth did little to soften the tension brewing in town. Word had spread like wildfire. Caleb Thornton intended to marry Eleanor Hayes. By the time church bells rang, nearly everyone had gathered, their whispers a tide that swelled louder with each passing minute. Eleanor walked slowly toward the chapel, her steps heavy but deliberate. She had made her choice the night before after hours of pacing the floor, tears mingling with prayers. Caleb had offered her more than security. He had offered her respect. And Anna's voice, soft and pleading, had echoed in her heart until she could no longer deny what she wanted as much as the child did. But Margaret would not surrender the gossip she had worked so hard to spread. Standing on the church steps in a crisp blue dress, she raised her voice as Eleanor approached. "This is madness," Margaret declared, loud enough for all to hear. "A mountain man, respected and strong, shackled to a woman who can barely keep herself. Eleanor Hayes is unfit. She's desperate, and this," she gestured sharply, "is nothing but her ploy to escape ruin." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some nodding, others uneasy. Eleanor's face burned, but she forced herself to meet Margaret's eyes. Before she could answer, Caleb's voice cut through, deep and steady. "Enough." The crowd parted as he strode forward, Anna at his side. His presence was undeniable, his gaze hard as flint. "You speak as though you know me, Margaret, but you do not. And you speak as though kindness is weakness, when it is the strongest thing I've seen in this town." Margaret scoffed. "Strong? She is mocked every day. What man would choose such shame?" Caleb stepped closer, his words ringing like iron on an anvil. "I would, and I have. I choose Eleanor Hayes not out of pity, but because she is the only soul in this town who carries herself with true dignity." The crowd shifted uneasily. Whispers rose and fell. Some stared at Eleanor with new eyes, others still with doubt. Margaret's face flushed crimson, her lips tightening in fury. Anna, small but fierce, pulled free of her father's hand and marched straight to Eleanor. She grasped her hand tightly, her little fingers firm as iron. "She's my mama now," Anna declared, her voice clear and ringing. "And I don't care what anybody says." The words hung in the air, silencing even the boldest tongues. Eleanor felt tears well, blurring her vision. She looked down at Anna, then up at Caleb, whose steady gaze held hers. In that moment, the judgment of the town no longer mattered. Margaret tried once more, her voice shrill. "This is folly. You'll regret it, Caleb. She'll drag you down with her." Caleb turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "No," he said. "She lifts me up. And if any here cannot see it, then that blindness is theirs, not mine." The silence that followed was heavy, but it was no longer cruel. Some faces softened, others turned away in shame. A few men even tipped their hats toward Eleanor, a quiet acknowledgement that things had changed. Eleanor's heart pounded. She had stood against scorn before, but never like this, never with a hand in hers and a man at her side. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt not like a widow defined by loss, but like a woman chosen, respected, loved. As Caleb guided her up the church steps, Anna skipping proudly between them, Eleanor realized the battle was not over. The town would not forget its whispers so easily. But today she had faced them, and today she had won. The morning of the wedding dawned calm, the air cool and clear after weeks of dust and storms. Dry Creek stirred slowly, its usual bustle softened by a quiet curiosity. Word had traveled fast. Caleb Thornton and Eleanor Hayes were to wed. Some came to see out of respect, others from disbelief, but all came, for nothing in recent memory had shaken the town quite like this union. Inside the small clapboard church, sunlight streamed through the windows, falling in soft patterns across the pews. Eleanor stood at the front, her hands clasped tightly, her breath unsteady. She wore a simple dress, the very best she owned, freshly pressed and smelling faintly of lavender she had tucked into the folds. Her hair, smoothed with care, gleamed in the morning light. She felt no grandeur, no finery, but dignity radiated from her all the same. Caleb entered with Anna at his side. The little girl wore a ribbon in her hair and carried wildflowers she had picked along the road. She beamed when she saw Eleanor, rushing forward to hug her tightly. "You look so pretty, Mamma," she whispered. The words nearly undid Eleanor, but she steadied herself with a trembling smile. The ceremony was simple, spoken with solemn grace by the pastor. There were no grand decorations, no choir, just the words of covenant and the quiet strength of those who meant them. When Caleb spoke his vows, his voice carried through the stillness. "I take you, Eleanor, not out of need, not out of pity, but because you are the truest soul I have known." Eleanor's eyes filled as she answered, her voice low but unwavering. "And I take you, Caleb, not for rescue, but for love freely given." When the pastor declared them man and wife, Anna clapped her hands, her joy unrestrained. The sound broke the solemnity, and for once laughter rose in the church without cruelty. Outside, the townsfolk gathered, some offering cautious congratulations, others merely watching. Margaret stood stiffly in the crowd, her face pale with barely concealed fury. Yet even she could not speak against what had been spoken before God and neighbor. Respect, reluctant though it might be, had taken root. Caleb placed his hand gently on Eleanor's back as they stepped into the sunlight. She felt the strength in his touch, not as a claim, but as steady support. The townsfolk's eyes were still upon her, but this time she did not bow her head. Instead, she met their gaze, her shoulders square, her chin high. She was no longer the obese widow whispered about in shadows. She was Eleanor Thornton, wife, mother, and mistress of a house that would no longer stand empty. That evening, their small family returned to the boarding house. The room smelled of fresh bread and wood smoke, warm and welcoming. Caleb set his pack by the door. Anna ran laughing through the halls, and Eleanor stood in the middle of it all, her heart swelling with a peace she had not felt since before Thomas's passing. Caleb came to her side, his voice low. "This house feels alive now." She looked around, eyes misting. "It feels like home again." Anna burst back into the room, clutching her doll. "Can we eat pie to celebrate?" she asked eagerly. Eleanor laughed through her tears, bending to kiss the girl's forehead. "Yes, darling. Tonight we'll have pie. The world outside might still hold whispers, but within those walls, love had claimed its place. And for Eleanor, that was enough to begin anew. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Eleanor had never dared imagine. The boarding house filled once more, not with ridicule but with the clamour of travellers who now spoke of her cooking with praise instead of scorn. Word of the storm had spread, and so had Caleb's public defence at the church. Where once her name had been a jest, it was now spoken with a grudging respect, and in some corners even admiration. Eleanor rose each morning before dawn, her hands steady as she kneaded dough, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Anna would sit nearby, chattering while brushing her doll's hair, and Caleb would bring in wood for the stove, his presence grounding, reliable. The house no longer echoed with emptiness, it pulsed with life. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of gold and violet, Eleanor stood on the porch, gazing out at the horizon. Caleb joined her, his arm brushing lightly against hers. For a long moment, they watched the fading light together in silence. "It feels different now," she murmured. "This place, my life, as if I've been given a second chance." Caleb nodded slowly. "You earned it. Through every cruel word you stood tall. I only helped steady what was already strong." Eleanor turned toward him, her eyes glistening. "You gave me more than steadiness. You gave me a family again." Inside, laughter rang out as Anna sang to her doll in a voice as sweet as the wind through the pines. Caleb smiled faintly. "She loves you," he said. "And I her," Eleanor whispered. "More than I thought my heart could hold." The moment hung between them, simple and profound. For Eleanor, the memory of Thomas would always remain, but grief no longer chained her. She had found room for love again, a love built not on appearances, but on quiet endurance, respect, and truth. Life in Dry Creek was still hard. The land remained harsh, the people still prone to gossip. But when Eleanor walked into town now, she no longer bent beneath their stares. Children no longer mocked her. Some even ran to Anna, eager to play. And though Margaret still wore her scorn like a weapon, her words carried little weight against the shield of family Eleanor had found. One afternoon, Eleanor paused outside the church where months before she had been humiliated. The memory came back sharp, the sting of Margaret's voice, the whispers, the laughter. But then another memory overlaid it. Caleb's voice cutting through the room, Anna's small hand clasping hers, the shift in the crowd when truth outweighed cruelty. She smiled faintly, knowing she would never forget either moment, for both had shaped the woman she had become. That night Eleanor tucked Anna into bed. The girl clung to her hand, whispering sleepily, "I knew you'd be my mama." Eleanor kissed her forehead, tears pricking her eyes. "And I knew, though I tried to deny it, that you were meant to be mine." She stepped out quietly, joining Caleb at the hearth. He handed her a cup of coffee, his eyes steady on her. No words were needed. In the glow of the fire, with the sounds of a sleeping child upstairs and the soft creak of a house alive once more, Eleanor finally felt whole. Her story had begun with scorn and solitude, but it ended with a truth she had fought to learn. Love is not measured by size, nor silenced by gossip. It is found in the strength to endure, in the courage to open one's heart again, and in the small, steady hand of a child who whispers the word, Mama. And as we close this chapter, if you've followed Eleanor's journey and found hope in her strength, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. There are more stories of resilience, redemption, and unexpected love waiting to be told. And don't forget to click on the video suggested here on the screen. Another tale awaits you there, ready to carry you deeper into the heart of the frontier.